Shavua Tov. We're here on Daf Yud Daled, I believe. Let me just see where we left off last time. Actually, we're still on, I think, Yud Gimel Amid Beis. And we recorded yesterday in the Mishnah on the top of Yud Gimel Amid Beis, the Shita Beit Shammai, that there is no Iser of Tzaras Ereva, Tzaras Ereva Misyabemis. And let's go over the Gemara, which we began yesterday. Omer Rav Shimon ben Pazi, my time at the Beit Shammai. From whence does Beit Shammai derive the conclusion that Tzaras Ereva Misyabemis? Tichsiv, the pasuk says, Lotia Eishes Hames Hachutza Le'ish Zar. And the word Hachutza is redundant. What are we going to derive from Hachutza? Hachutza is what's called chitzonit. She's on the outside, meaning there's the erva herself, and then there's the tzaras erva. She's called chitzonah. And why is she called chitzonah? Because with regard to the erva, there's a close biological relationship. Chutza mechlal de'ika pnimis. In other words, there's a krova to the yavam. The krova to the yavam, which is the opposite of chutza, that's the erva. And the chutza, which is the chitzonis, who is relatively chitzonis to the pnimis, she is none other than the tzara. And Omer Achmano lo sia leish zar, which means that she falls for yibum. She cannot marry anyone from the shuk. Beis Hillel, what are they doing with this pasuk? Miboile, they need the pasuk for the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda Marav. The Omer Rabbi Yehuda Marav, minayin she'ein kiddushin, tovsim b'yavama. How do we know that Yavama Lashuk, she didn't get chalitza, now she married someone else, the kiddushin to that person is not valid? How do we derive that? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, Lotia ishes hameis hachutza lish zar. What does Lotia mean? Lotia ba havaya. There's no tfisas kiddushin to an ish zar. So Beit Shammai respond with that which we anticipate. We can guess already. Mi ksiv lachutz, chutza ksiv. I mean, the Torah, if it only was interested in teaching me this halacha, that there's no tfisas kiddushin in Yavam Lashuk, lish zar, what does the word chutza mean? It could have said chutz. Chutz means to anyone other than the Yavam. Beis Hillel, how does he justify the word chutza? B'kevan d'chsiv chutza, keman d'chsiv lachutz dami. In other words, it should have said lachutz. But whenever the Torah wants to give you a lamed and then a subject to that lamed, the Torah has another option: leave out the lamed and add a hey at the end of the word. The Gemara is going to give a number of examples. Isanya, Rabbi Nechemi Omer, called Teva Shetzricha Lamed B'Tchilase Hitoba Kosev Hey B'Sofa, B'Chein Tana Demei Rabbi Yishmael Kigon. For example, with regard to the moment in time when the Jews during the sojourn in the wilderness, they came to a place called Elim, or Elim. So the Torah says, Vayavo Elima. It doesn't say Elim or Li Elim, but rather it says E Elima. Or David HaMelech comes to a place called Machanayim in Shmuel Beis, and it says Machnayma. Instead of saying Li Machanayim, it says Machnayma, adding a hey at the end. Also, Avram Avinu goes down to Mitzrayim in Parshas Vayer, and it says Vayered Avram Mitzrayma. What does Mitzrayma mean? Le Mitzrayim. Another example in Bamidbar Lamed Gimel Vayachanu Be'almon Div Lasaima. Or Vataveosi Yerushalayma. Or Ad Levo Midbara. So therefore, according to Beis Hillel, the word chutza is equal to the word lachutz. And the Torah prefers to drop the lamed, and it's a little bit more poetic when the Torah adds the hey at the end to substitute for the lamed at the beginning. And that's what, but lotia eish zames lachutz, that's really what it means to say. So there's no extra hey in the word chutza, because the hey is needed in order to replace the lamed of lachutz. So the Gemara asks, this is where we got up to, I think, on Yom Chamishi, Ubeit Shammai. Beit Shammai, who darshan the word chutza to be mater tzaras erva, is the Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Allah of Ein Kedushin Tosim Yavam L'Shuk Minolahu. Once the thrust of the pasuk is coming to tell you that the Iser of Yavam L'Shuk before Chalitza applies even to a case of a Tzaras Erva, then I don't have a pasuk to teach me that there's no Kedushin Tovsim in a Yavam L'Shuk. I need this pasuk to prohibit Yavam L'Shuk, even in a law, even in a case of a Tzaras Erva. So the Gemara answers, Mi ish zar nafka. It says, Lo siya li ish zar. Beit Shammai argue that when the Torah says, Lo siya eishes hameis hachutza, it could have said lazar. What's leish zar? The leish zar tells me that I go back to the lo siya and I darshan it in two ways. Lo siya leish and lo siya lazar. One lo siya sets up the lav that since she didn't get chalitza from the Yavam, she's not allowed to marry another man. And the other losia is telling me that there's no avaya, there's no tfisas kiddush. Beisil nami tekule mi leish zar. Why not derive that there's no tfisas kiddushin in Yavam L'Shuk from leish zar? And he adds here a comment. He says, "Sharei kain mashme bilosia she'ein ba'avaya lizar v'lama marchutza." That the thrust of the Gemara's question here is that if leish zar is able to teach me, as Beit Shammai insists, that there's no tfisas kedushin in Yavam L'Shuk, so why does it say hachutza? You could drop the word hachutza. And the Gemara says, "Einoch inami." You really do derive that there's no tfisas kedushin in Yavam L'Shuk from leish zar. Is chutza lomali l'rabos arutza. The Torah wants to tell you by adding the word chutza that there's a case of yibum that you and I might not have anticipated, and that's the case of an arusa. So it means the following: there are two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. If Reuven marries Leah and dies without children, then Leah falls for Yibum to Shimon. But what happens if Reuven didn't marry Leah, but rather he only had Erisin with Leah, without Nisuin? I would have thought in the Havamina that in such a case, when Reuven dies, his wife, in quotation marks, his Arusa, does not fall for Yibum. There's no din of Yibum in an Arusa. The Torah generated the halacha of Yibum only in a full-fledged marriage of Nisuin. Kamash Malan, the Torah is now teaching me with the word chutza that a woman who's only an arusa, nevertheless, she, like a woman who's a nesua, full-fledged married wife, will fall for yibum with the death of a husband. How do we see that from the word chutza? Chutza means a yevama who is chitzona lebaila. She's married, but chitzona, she's outside of his realm. She's still living in her father's house. Because up until Nisuin, after Erisin, there's never been and cannot be an intimacy at that point, and therefore she's chutza. So now we can anticipate the Gemara's question: what is Beit Shammai going to do with this halacha of an arusa, since he uses the hachutza to teach me that a tzaras erva falls for yibum? He doesn't have the word achutza free to teach me an arusa. Ve'idach, Gemara answers, michutza. There are two drashos here from one word. There's the word chutza, and then it says hachutza with an extra hey. So one din we're going to derive from the word chutza, and the other din we're going to derive from the extra hey. Again, it's not clear which din is derived from which, but it's irrelevant. We have two dinim and two ribuyim to include ladies that we thought were outside and excluded from the purview of yibum. We're going to bring them inside. One is going to be the tzaras erva, and the other is going to be the arusa. Ve'idach, what is Beis Hillel going to say when you have an extra hey at the beginning of the word chutza, which would allow you to darshan an additional drasha to include a tzaras erva like Beit Shammai? And the Gemara answers, chutza hachutza lo mashmalei. This is not considered an extra hey, because the Torah very often adds a hey at the beginning of a word for poetic, dramatic purposes. Ha-chutza. So the hey is not subject to a drush. He points out here in the note that the Gemara actually later on in this Masechet Yevamot on Daf Tzadi Beis actually records a machlokas tanoim between Shmuel and Rav on this very point as to whether or not there is tfisas kedushin in Yevamot Lashuk. And therefore, it's interesting, the Gemara here could have said that maybe Beis Hillel hold like Shmuel against Rav, and there is tfisas kedushin. Hence, the question, how do you derive two halachas from a chutza, is not a question, because the second halacha is not accepted by Beis Hillel. See, he says, Gam l'shitaso, which I assume means, according to Shmuel, Yesh liyashiv eshitas Beis Hillel, mishum di ein posuk zeh miyutar lahatir tzara, el nitzrach lesser Yevamot Lashuk be'iser la. So basically, Tosfos works it out that we can reconcile Beis Hillel even with Beit Shammai, and the extra pasuk here is to teach you the lav, although it doesn't teach you eat tfisas kiddush. Rava Amar, Rava now has a new twist, a new perspective on the machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai regarding tzaras erva. Tamai de Beit Shammai, the reason why Beit Shammai established a mitzvah of yibum, a heter of yibum, in the case of a tzaras erva, is not because of a drasha, but because of a logical deduction. So Rava says, forget about hachutza and the entire drush. The ein iser chal al iser. We have a principle that once something is usur, you cannot add an additional iser to a pre-existing iser. And now, what you have is the following. An erva, according to this approach of Rava in Beit Shammai, can only be prohibited under one category of erva. You cannot add another category of an erva. So if you ask me, can a woman have two isurim or only one isur? The answer is only one isur, because ein isur chal al isur. And the Gemara is going to explain what this is all about. Now, keep in mind, just in the back of your thinking caps, when you say ein isur chal isur, what does that mean? Does that mean that the second isur is not chal at all, or it means it's chal but it doesn't generate a punishment because you've already been warned about a punishment from the first isur? Okay. Now, since, John, you have the Masifta, I'm going to point out that we're now turning to Yud Gimel and Beis, okay? Beis for bracious, okay. The Gemara asks the following kasha. Tenach heicha de nasa mes. The achar kach nasa chai. This makes sense if first the deceased brother married and generated an isur of ishes ach vis-a-vis the other brothers. And then, subsequently, the living brother, who's called the Achachai, married the sister of the Achames's wife. So we have Reuven, who's married to Rachel, and Shimon now marries Leah. And if you look in the diagram here, he says, Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Rachel and Leah are sisters. Shimon marries Leah. Leah now is Asura on Reuven, Bidin Eshes Ach. And now Shimon marries, in addition to Leah, Sarah. So Shimon has two wives. Now, Reuven marries Rachel, the sister of his brother's wife, meaning Shimon's wife, Leah. Now we apply the principle of ein isur chal isur. Leah is Asura on Reuven b'Torah Seishasah. Now Reuven marries Rachel, which would mean that Leah becomes Asura on Reuven under an additional erva of Achos Ishto. Kolzman, that Reuven did not marry Rachel, Leah's status was Eishes Ach, vis-a-vis Reuven. Now Reuven marries Rachel, and the status of Leah vis-a-vis Reuven is now enhanced, so to speak, with the additional erva of Achos Ishto, because Rachel now has been married to Reuven, And with the marriage of Rachel to Ruvain, Leah becomes Achos Ishto. However, we have a principle called Ein Iser Chal Iser, and now the Iser of Achos Ishto is not going to be Chal in the relationship here between Ruvain and Leah. And the reason for that is because she was already Asur Olav with an Iser of Eishes Ha. Now Shimon dies without children. His wives fall to Ruvain for Yibum. One of his wives is Sarah. Beit Shammai hold that she's not a Tzaras Ereva. Why? Because she's a Tzar to Leah, and Leah is Asura LeRuvain only in the Yisur Eishes Ah, which for the purpose of Yibum, the Torah removes the Yisur Eishes Ah. Now the question is, what about Leah herself? Why is she Asura on Ruvain? Let's apply Yibum to be Matir Yisur Eishes Ah. You'll tell me, but there's also an additional Yisur of Achos Ishto. No, there's no additional Yisur of Achos Ishto because ain't Yisur Chal Yisur. So I don't know what's the difference between Leah herself and Sarah Hatzara. In both cases, we should say that Yibum is Matir the Yisur Erev of Eishes Ha. There's another additional Yisur of Achos Ishto. The answer is no, ain't Yisur Chal Yisur. So this is the question that's raised by Tosfos. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for the fifth Tosfos on this page. The Imtomar Kevon the Yisur Achos Isha Lo Chayli Tisyabim Erev Gufa. Why should Leah herself fall for you? And in my humble opinion, what Tosfos is going to answer here, we'll see if I can fit it into the words of Tosfos, is that you misunderstand Ein Yisur Chal Yisur. Ein Yisur Chal Yisur doesn't mean what you think it means on the surface level. It means that the second Yisur is Chal, but it's waiting to be Chal in a complete way, so that when we remove the original, the first Yisur, the second Yisur now takes over. So in the case of Leah, vis-a-vis Ruvain, she is really Achos Ishto from the very moment that Ruvain marries Rachel. Leah was already Eishes Achiv and Yisur Chal Yisur, but it doesn't matter because if and when we remove the Yisur of Eishes Ach, as we'll do in the case of Yibum, we're still stuck with the Yisur Erev of Achos Ishto. Not so in the case of the Torah. In the case of the Torah, once you remove the Yisur of Eishes Ach by virtue of Yibum, then all systems go. There's no other additional Erev. And that's what I think he means. He says, Yesh lomar de Yisur Achos Isha mitla tolui v'kod. Ipaka Yisur Eishes Ach Asi v'chayel hilkoch lo paka. We cannot remove the Yisur Eishes Ach with regard to Leah, because Leah is the sister of Ruvain's wife, Rachel. So the very moment that you're going to remove the Yisur Eishes Ach, you're still stuck with an erva, a different erva of Achos Ishto. Now I'm thinking it out loud again. Maybe Tosfos' chiddush here is a little bit different than what I said. What Tosfos wants to know is if a certain factor, we'll call it X, generates an Isur, but it cannot generate that Isur because there already is a pre-existing Isur. Do we need that factor to be activated when we remove the original Isur? No. Tos says you don't need to do anything. Just Shevi Altas. The second Isur will be Chal automatically once you remove the first Isur. That's the main Chiddush of Tosfos. So that if, in this case, vis-a-vis Leah, you're going to apply Yibum to remove the Eshes Ach, then automatically the Erva of Achos Isha will be Chal. I don't need to, recreate the marriage that generates the Erva of Eshes Ach. Obviously, that's not applicable to the Tzara. Is therefore going back to the Gemara, Lo asi Isur Achos Isha v'chayel Isur Eshes Ach. Just 1 second, I lost the. Lo asi Isur Achos Isha v'chayel Isur Eshes Ach. Right. Again, we're talking about. Sorry, I lost the mathematics here. We're talking about Beit Shammai, and we're saying that the moment that Reuven marries Rachel, Ein Isur Chal Isur kicks in as far as Leah is concerned, meaning Leah does not become, in addition to Eshes Achiv, Achos Ishto, is Memela, the Tzara of Shimon, the Tzara of Shimon is not a Tzaras Erev. That's Beit Shammai. What do you mean she's not a Tzaras Erev? She's a Tzara of an Achos Ishto. But the answer is that the Achos Ishto is removed based on Ein Isur Chal Isur. Ella, but here I don't understand. What if the sequence was reversed? Nasa Hachai, Chai is Reuven. So Reuven marries Rachel first, and therefore Leah at that moment in time is already considered an erva of Achos Ishto. Achar Kach, subsequently, Nasa, we're talking about Shimon, who's going to die, unfortunately. Nasa Hames, Es Achos Isha. Nasa Hames Es Achosa. So now Shimon marries Leah. Nimtza she'Isur Achos Ishta Kadin. Before the Isur of Eshes Ach, actually, when you think about it, let's just think. The moment, let's get this clear. The moment that Shimon marries Leah, both Isurim Achal simultaneously. But why do we say here, the Gemara says that Achos Isha Kadin, at the Isur of Achos Ishta, with regard to Leah, is Chal, on Leah with regard to Reuven is Chal before the Isur of Eshes Ach. Just 1 second. So again, let's go over the mathematics. Since Reuven married Rachel before Shimon married Leah, before Shimon married Leah, So again, Shimon's marriage to Leah should have generated an Iser Erev of Ashes Ah vis-a-vis Reuven, but it cannot do so because this woman that Shimon is marrying by the name of Leah is already Achos Ishto of Reuven. So with the moment of Shimon's marriage to Leah, he does not generate an Iser Erva of Ashes Ach on Leah vis-a-vis Reuven because she's already Asura b'Toras Achos Ishto. So if that be the case, then how do we understand Beit Shammai in that scenario where the marriage to one of the two sisters, the first marriage to one of the two sisters was that of the surviving brother, meaning the Yavam. In such a case, the Iser Erev of Achos Ishto would have been Chal even before she became a Eshes Ah. So the Gemara answers, Kevan below Osi Iser Eshes Ach V'chayel A Iser Achos Isha Havilei Tzoras Erva Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah V'Sharya. Since we're going to apply the principle of Eid Iser Chal Iser, and therefore the Iser of Eshes Ach is not going to be Chal on top of the Iser Achos Ishto, is therefore Ein Badin Eshes Ach Klal, he can Nachris Etzla. The Ein Nofel Sefam Liyibu. Leah is a Nachris. What do you mean Leah is a Nachris? I'll tell you why Leah is a Nachris. Because she has no din of Eshes Ach. Very sharp. Do you hear what's going on here, Beit Shammai? It's a whole new perspective. What we're saying is that there's no mitzvah yibum at all vis-a-vis Leah. And the reason for that is because there's no erev of Eshes Ach. So paradoxically, we're using any Sechal Lisur to remove yibum. Normally, we would have said, well, if any Isur Achal Isur, so there's no Isur of Eshes Ach. I'm sorry, there's no Isur of Achos Ishto, and hence there should be Yibum. Now we're saying any Isur Achal Isur works the opposite way. It removes Yibum completely. Why? Because we're saying now that the Isur of Eshes Ach will not be Chal, because the Isur of Achos Ishto took over the ball game, so to speak, the headlines. So once you have the Isur of Achos Ishto, and that's because Reuven had married Rachel before Shimon married Leah. So therefore, Leah is already Achos Ishto of Reuven. Now, when Shimon marries Leah, I'm sorry, when Shimon marries Leah, Leah does not become an erva of Eshes Achid. She's already an erva of Achos Ishto. And if there's no erva of Eshes Achid, then there's no mitzvah yibum at all. And if there's no mitzvah yibum at all, then Shimon's other wife, who's the tzara of Leah, falls for yibum, and she's not a tzaras erva. He writes here, Lefisha ein erva poteres es tzarasa, elim ken yesh bo nefilas yibum. You could have a havamina to say that a tzaras erva is excluded from yibum because she had a nefila together with the erva. But here there was no nefila with the erva. Ela she'i nidches mimenu machmas ptur erva. But here there is no ptur erva. Why? Because there's no nefila for yibum. Let's just see if he adds anything here. In number Yud Aleph on the bottom right, he quotes the Rashba. Shafilu shehi nofeles lefanov lefnei shar ha'achim. The Rashba points out something that's almost obvious. You know, when you say that Leah doesn't fall for Yibum, that's a little bit tricky. Because in truth, Leah does fall for Yibum, although not to Ruvain, but to the other brothers. He says, as far as Ruvain is concerned, then he writes in the name of Shimon Shkop, he says, She'ikar din yibum hula hakim shemli achiv kolzman sha'isha dayan eshes achiv ames v'afshalach amisa paka ishus ein ze el sharon yoni ishus aval yosa al achiv al echav dayan nisharba ishus. V'im ein din ha'ishus oseres al echav v'yachar misa ein hi ishto l'shum davar memela ein ba din yibum kol ikar. Arei hi ki erva shalo b'makom mitzvah. What is Reb Shimon adding over here? Since the purpose of yibum is what l'hakim shem li'achiv. And I think he's referring here to Zikas Yibum. Avli Osra al Achiv Adayin Nisher Ba Ishus. Ein Dina Ishus O Seres al Achiv Li Achar Moso. Ein Hi Ishto L'Shum Davar. So he's saying that the Zikas Yibum that sets up the mitzvah of Yibum is a continuation of the Ishus of the deceased brother, which generates an Isser of Eshes Ach vis-a-vis the other Ach. But if there's no Ishus to generate Eshes Ach, then there's no din yibum at all, because there's nothing left to the issues of the deceased, in this case of Shimon. Now, let's take a quick look at Number Yud Beis. And he quotes the Tosi Shonim. Hello. Lule svaras eini sechal isur, hayumodim beit shamai lidroshas halitzra. Right, according to Rava here, in theory, if not for the eini sechal isur svara, then Beit Shammai would have accepted the drush of Litzra. In other words, you have a contradiction between the drush of Litzra and the logic and the application of the principle of Eini Sechal Litzra. It's a toss-up. I don't know which way to go. Why not accept the drasha of Litzra? The ilu din any sechal liser enel svar bialm. So I don't know. The assumption here of the Tosi Shonim is that a drasha trumps a svara, is greater than a svara. In a choice, in a toss-up or stira between a drasha and a svara, we will opt for the drasha and drop the svara. honestly, I'm not 100% convinced that that has to be so. I mean, who am I to disagree with Tosi Shad? But intuitively, I would have said, Adarab, a svara is greater than a drasha, because a drasha, you could always say, well, we should darshan in a different way. But a svara, I mean, that's logically compelling. V'tirtzu b'shem hakadosh ma'arish is one of the Bali Atosus. Ma'amidim beit Shammai es halitzor k'sheboim shnei ha'isurim b'vasachas. That Enochinami, there is one scenario in which Beit Shammai do accept the drush of litzor, kigon, biskaju li echov, kishehein pchusos miyud gimel shanim, she'ena chashuvas erva ashubenos shalosh. So the erva relationship in the Shem erva only emerges when they become 3 years old. And in such a case, then both isurim are boim bevas achas. But I don't understand the scenario. Why are both isurim bevas achas? And one of these two sisters became 3 years old. She had a birthday before the other sister. Well, what's the case here? Sheboim shnei isurim bevas achas, kigon shehiskachu li achiv kishehein chutzos as sholosh shanim. So I think we're talking about Shimon, and Shimon is married to 2 wives. He's married to Leah, and he's married to Sarah. And both Kedushians took place when the girls were less than 3. That's Leah and Sarah. And both the Shem Erev of both Eishes Achiv and Achos Ishto Achal B'vas Achas. I don't get exactly how that works. Why should it be B'vas Achas? Gonshis Kadshu Li Achiv Kishehein Pchusos Mi Gimel Shanim. John, do you have this? It's footnote number Yud Beit. So what does he mean? Boim shnei ha'isurim bevas achas kigon sheskadshu li achiv kishein pchusos mibas gimel shanim. Do we have it? Again, he's looking for a case where both the Surim of erva would be chal b'vas achas. And I'm not sure what the case is here. I'm looking here in the Tosi Shonim. It's about 2/3 of the way down on my page. V'tireitz hakadosh mereish the ikol ukmi litzark shebo b'vas achas eishes achos isha v'kula rayis. Gone. You go bito shekidesh kidesh bito li achiv chusam ibashol shanim v'chalu eishes ach ubito yachad she'ene chashuva erva ad shetei bas gimel. Just 1 second. I think I got it. So in the case, 1 second. So he marries, just 1 second. He marries Leah. So Shimon marries Leah, and Leah is now less than 3 years old. And the Rosh is saying, the Riash is saying, that the Shem Erev of Eshes Achiv will only be Chal at the age of 3, and at that moment, the Erev of Achos Ishto will also kick in. So both Arayos of Achos Ishto and Eshes Ach will be Chal the moment that she reaches the age of 3. And in that case, the Tzoras Erva, we'll call a Sarah, would be Mesyabemes to Reuven. No, I'm sorry. And in that case, the Tzoras Erva Sarah would not be Mesyabemes to Reuven, even according to Beit Shammai, because the 2 Arayos would be Chal b'vas achas. And that makes the Sarah into a Tzoras Erva. Ikshu od halo adayin mishkachas la afla Beit Shammai sheyochel isur achos isha ubechol zos techashiv le'erva b'makom mitzvah igon shenosa mes umes v'nafla liyibu v'achar kach nosa chai es achosa shemiachar shekvar hutar eshes ach shuv ein mokom li'iser achos isha lachul the lifter osav es tzarasa miyibum. Well, that's complicated. What's he saying now? Nasa mes umes. That means Shimon married Leah and then died. The achakach nasa chai, which I guess he means that Reuven then married Rachel, and Shimon had already died. My time at the Beit Shammai, the lekel memar eni sechal iser, sharei kishemes, hoisa eshes ach b'makom mitzvah. B'imkein osi iser achos isha v'chayel. So that would make her into a tzaras erev. I don't get the kasha. Once again, I need your help here, Rabbo. So you're very quiet today. Od halo adai mishkachas la'af lebeit Shammai sheyochel iser achos isha ol sikosha ve'erva b'makom mitzvah kagon shenosa mes umes. Okay, so right now Shimon died. Nafla, and now his wife Leah falls for Yibam. So now Reuven marries Rachel. Me'acha shekvar hutar iser eshes ach Ishuv yesh makom li'iser achos isha lachul. The liftar osav es sarasa miyibum. See, I always thought that in order to pater the tzara for yibum, you would have to have the status of the tzaras erev at the time of the misa. Here, after the misa of Shimon, Reuven marries Rachel. So now Shimon's wife Sarah becomes a tzaras erva. We just see if by chance that's the answer he gives. Mitirtzu sheba'ofen zeh afle beis Hillel ein atzar potes mishum she'ein noeg p'tur tzarel kein hoisa tzaras erva b'chai bal. I think he's saying the same thing that we said. At the tzaras erva status means that she was a tzaras erva at the moment of the misa. Here, at the moment of the misa, she was not a tzaras erva, because Leah was nothing more than Eshes Ak, and there was a mitzvah of Yibum. It could be that later when Shimon marries Reuven, he removes the mitzvah of Yibum as far as Leah is concerned, because Leah is now Achos Ishto. That could be possible, but it doesn't make the tzara of Shimon, namely Sarah, into a tzaras erev. That's what I think. That's what I think he's saying. Now the Mishnah says, "Cholzu Beit Shammai poslim min kahuna u Beis Hillel machshirim." So the Gemara says, "Pshita." It goes without saying that according to Beit Shammai, since the status of the tzaras erev is that she falls for yibum, hence the chalitza is a meaningful chalitza. And a chalutza is asur l'kohen. I don't need the Mishnah to tell me that. On the other hand, it's pshita according to Beis Hillel that the tzaras erva is muteres l'kohen. She's just an almana. She's not a grusha or a chalutza, because any chalitza that he gave her is meaningless. She didn't fall for yibum at all. So I'll tell you what I would have said. The Gemara is not going to give this answer, but there's something called reach haget. That even if there really is no get, but it looks like a get, and in the eyes of the spectator, they think it's a serious get, and the Rabbanan will institute a rabbinic Isur L'Kahuna when it looks like a get. Here too, it might look like a chalitza, because after all, this woman was in fact married to the mess, and she's an erva, and she's a tzaras erva, and therefore it looks like the chalitza is a bona fide chalitza. But let's see the Gemara's answer. Lafuke, the Gemara says that the chiddush here is to exclude Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Amar Bo v'nesakim. This is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's statement. Lahem latzaro shiu choltzos v'lo misyabnos. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is worried about Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai holds that in the case of tzaras erva, she falls for yibum and requires chalitza. Why not be machmir in the case of tzaras erva? Says Rabbi Yochanan, I advocate that we should insist on a chalitza. Kamash Malon to Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel hold that a tzaras erva is patur legamrei, and there's no din of chalitza at all. Nisyabma is Beit Shammai machshirin and Beis Hillel post. So the Gemara asks Hasu Lamali. Once again, this is Pshita. According to Beit Shammai, there's a mitzvah of Yibum, so there's no psul over here. And according to Beis Hillel, she's a zona because there's an erva here of Eishes in the case of tzaras erva. So the Gemara answers, Aidi the Tana, this is what we call Agav, Aidi the Tana Choltu, Tana Nami Nisyab. Once there's a chiddush that we mentioned earlier against Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in the case of Chalitza, so he mentions Yibum as well to round off the corners. Tanan Hasam, let's just see what time it is. All right, maybe we'll go for another 3 minutes or so just to get a haskala on the next sugya. The next sugya is a pretty big sugya. And we're talking about agudos. That's a drasha from Lotus Godadu, which is a pasuk. Where does it say Lotus Godadu? He doesn't tell you here, but we'll get to it a little bit later. And Tanan Hasam, we have a Mishnah at the very beginning of Megillah, that Megillah nikreis b'achadasar, b'shnemasar, b'shloshasar, b'arbasar, b'chamishasar, lo pachos v'lo yos. So what does this mean? Lo pachos v'lo yosef. The latest time for Kriyas HaMegillah is on the 15th of Adar. Shebekrochim amukafim choma mimotzi Yoshua ben Nun. But you have a city like Yerushalayim, let's say, is Mukaf Choma from Yoshua ben Nun, is we read the Megillah on the 15th. The open cities that are not walled, read the Megillah on the 14th. The smaller villages, sometimes we'll read Megillah as early as Yud Aleph, the 11th. The 11th, the 12th, and the 13th, depending upon when is the Yom HaKnisa. Whenever they come in for Kriyas HaTorah or for Dinim, when the Bezdin is sitting, that's when we're going to read the Megillah for the Kfarim. Amar Le Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. How could it possibly be, asks Rabbi Reish Lakish, that different groups of people will be obligated in the same mitzvah on different days? Ikri Khan Lotus Godadu. This is a violation of Lotus Godadu. Oh, it's a pasuk in Re'eh. I forgot where it was. Dvarim Yudal. Lotasu agudos. Because we can't divide up the community of Israel into two or more groups so that they fulfill the mitzvahs on different days. It looks like there are two Torahs. Like there's one Torah given to the Bnei Akfarim, another Torah to the Bnei Aprazim, a third Torah to the Bnei Akrachim. How do you derive from Lotus Godadu that you cannot make agudos? We need Lotus Godadu for the din of Chabura alames, meaning that you're not allowed to cut into your flesh as an expression of mourning in the case of a loss of one of your relatives. So Gemara answers in Kain Lemakra Lotis Goded. Lotig Goded. Umay Lotis Godedu. Shmamino Lahachi Hudios. the ema kule, maybe the entire pasuk lahachi hu di asa, only to prohibit chabur al ames. The Gemara answers in Kain lema kro lo tagod, by lo tisgodu shma mino tarti. The two isurim written in the same pasuk. You're not allowed to make a chabur al ames, and you're not allowed to divide up the community of Israel into agudos. And this is all derived from the extra tav in the word lo tisgodu. Now, once we have a source for this isur, the Gemara now has to come back to Reish Lakish's question: how could they divide up Megillah reading into different groups? It should be a violation of lo tisgodu. Amalei, and Rabbi Yochanan responds to Reish Lakish, Ad kan lo shanisa. When do we apply the principle of lo tisgodu and set up different places and different laws for different places? That's only makom shenagu lasos malach be'ervi psachim. Ad chatzos osim makom shenagu shelo lasos ein osim. So we see that we do divide up the prohibition of malacha on Erev Pesach into different groups, into different makomos. Each one has its own midah. So the law of asiyas malacha on Erev Pesach actually changes from makom to makom. So why don't you ask me your kash on that? On the Mishnah in Arei Psachim about the Isur Malacha on Erev Pesach, which depends upon minhag makom. Amalei amina lecha na isura. I'm asking about the times for Kriyat Shema B'dafka, because it's not permissible for the Bnei Ayaros to read the Megillah on Tesvav. And yet the Krachim, the Bnei Krachim, are allowed and even obligated to read the Megillah on Tesvav. So how can we set up the Bnei Ayaros to read on Yudalid and prohibit them from reading on Tesvav? Or alternatively, how can we set up the Kriya of the Prozim on Yudalid, prohibiting the Bnei Krachim from reading it on Yudalid? But that is not comparable to Chiluke Minhagim on, for example, Malach on Erev Pesach, Mimakom Lemakom, because really it's mutter according to everybody. Every tzibur, every sector of the population is allowed, permitted to do Malach on Erev Pesach. In certain places, they took up a chumrah on themselves, but it wasn't part of the original takana. So we're going to see that Rabbi Yochanan is going to have to deal with this question of how they divided up the population of Israel vis-a-vis the chiyuv of Megillah to different days, and why that does not constitute a violation of the Isur of lo tisgodu. Okay, then, so let's just make a note of where we got up to. The Omer Rav Shemen Bar Ab. That's for Monday. Amen. Amen. Wishing you a great day. Thank you so much.